Good morning. This is the sixth lecture of the last testing period in History 2303. When we met last time, we ended our discussion talking about the possibility that the mob or the KGB or others killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The one scenario that I did not suggest to you, and it was considered for a while, is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, that President Kennedy was thinking about a way to get rid, i.e. to drop Lyndon Baines Johnson from the ticket in 1964. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were two different individuals, very much so. Kennedy was suave, educated at Harvard. Lyndon was homegrown Texan, a graduate of Southwest Texas State Teachers College, and he was very proud of that fact. Not that he shouldn't be, but it wasn't a Harvard education. And President Kennedy was a smooth operator, and Lyndon was a pretty rough and gruff, take it as you see it politician. And President Kennedy had considered dropping Lyndon Johnson from the ticket. I'm not sure how we'd ever carried Texas without Lyndon in 1964, but nevertheless, President Kennedy considered it, at least for a while, potentially dropping Lyndon Johnson from the ticket. And that gives rise to another theory, a theory that was first published in a book written in 1964 during the presidential election year, Barry Goldwater versus Lyndon Johnson. A book was published that was very critical of Lyndon Johnson. It was called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. It was written by J. Edward Haley, a professor at West Texas State in Canyon, Texas. And A Texan Looks at Lyndon, you can still buy it at used bookstores for about a quarter because there were millions of them printed. But in A Texan Looks at Lyndon, J. Edward Haley suggested that the first place that Lee Harvey Oswald went to after he returned from Russia, he returned to the United States, was to South Texas, and allegedly met with the Parr brothers, George and Archie Parr. They were friends of Lyndon Johnson, and indeed they were political cronies. Lyndon Johnson helped the Parr brothers in many ways, and they in turn continued to give the South Texas vote to Lyndon and the Democratic Party. And J. Edward Haley suggests that the first place that Lee Harvey Oswald went to was to South Texas to visit with the Parr brothers, because the Parr brothers were in trouble. One of the Parr brothers, I think it was George, had already gone to the federal penitentiary for illegalities, political illegalities, and Archie, the other brother, was soon to be indicted for all kinds of activity, illegal activity relative to the IRS and the payment of taxes or failure to pay taxes, and bribes, kickbacks, etc. And that gave rise to the theory that perhaps in order to curry the favor of Lyndon Johnson, that the Parr brothers hired Lee Harvey Oswald to kill John Fitzgerald Kennedy, because their good friend Lyndon would become president, and presidents can pardon and parole criminals at his leisure, and he's not accountable to anyone for his pardons and paroles. And so an argument could be made, and J. Edward Haley tried to do it in A Texan Looks at Lyndon, that Lyndon Johnson perhaps had his good friends, the Parr brothers, execute John Fitzgerald Kennedy. That is not a plausible argument with me, I will tell you this, because in Lady Bird Johnson's memoirs about her time as First Lady, when Lyndon was President of the United States, she writes about that day, Dallas, November the 22nd, of 1963, when President Kennedy was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lyndon Johnson was in the cavalcade of automobiles. He was like in the third or fourth car. President Kennedy's limousine being the first in a cavalcade of government sedans that went into Dealey Plaza. So when the shots were fired, a great big burly Secret Service agent by the name of Rufus Youngblood literally threw himself into Johnson's limousine and smothered the Vice President of the United States, literally pushed him down into the seat and covered Lyndon Johnson's body with his own as the cavalcade of cars rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the emergency room. Secret Service police immediately ran out all the poor people who were in need of medical care, and they carried the body of President President John Fitzgerald Kennedy into Parkland Hospital, and the doctors immediately went to work on President Kennedy, trying to save his life. Lyndon Johnson was shepherded just down the hall from where the doctors were fighting feverishly to save President Kennedy's life, and about every 15 minutes a doctor would show up. Lyndon was sitting in a room with Lady Bird by themselves, and in a closed room, and the doctor would come in on occasion, open the curtain up and say, "Mr. Vice President, here's the condition of President Kennedy." And Lady Bird Johnson, writing her memoirs, later said that she would never forget the look of horror on her husband's face when a doctor walked into the sitting room where she and Lyndon were sitting quietly, contemplating, no doubt, the horror of the moment. And the doctor looked at Lyndon Johnson and he said, "Mr. President," acknowledging that John Fitzgerald Kennedy had died and that Lyndon Johnson was President of the United States. Lady Bird said she never saw a look of horror on Lyndon's face as he had on that moment when it sank in that he was now President of the United States upon the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So I rather doubt that that Lyndon Johnson had anything to do with the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, but we needed to talk about that. The truth is that because of the prestige of the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, and through his protege, Texas Governor John Conley, Lyndon suppressed the factionalism that had gone on in the Democratic Party to a significant degree after he became President of the United States. Despite Senator Ralph Yarborough, the liberal senator from Texas, attempts to win control of the state Democratic Executive Committee, Conley's near martyrdom in the John Fitzgerald Kennedy killing gave him a clear advantage over the liberals in the state of Texas. And indeed, in the 1964 state primary, John Conley, recently released from the hospital after extensive surgery and rehab, was renominated and easily defeated his Republican rival. And John Conley controlled the state Democratic Convention, and he controlled the Texas delegation sent to the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Exercising enormous amount of control over the legislature, Conley supported educational reforms, a state fine arts commission for the state of Texas, and it was John Conley who said, "Texas has so many multiplicities, levels of government, that we need another level of government called COGS, C-O-G-S, Councils of Government." A council of government was to be established for every metropolitan area that had over 100,000 Texas citizens living in a metropolitan area. As of about 15 years ago, there were 25 COGS in the state of Texas. There are probably more than that today. A COG, again, is a planning group for any area of Texas that has more than 100,000 people living in it. For instance, the Alamo Area Council of Governments, COG, is the organization of counties, cities, municipal entities, educational entities, because an educational entity, ISD taxes, and it functions as a government. All all groups within a council, within a standard metropolitan statistical area containing 100,000 minimum, 100,000 Texans, has to have a council of government. Why? Because with the multiplicity of counties and cities and taxing entities, fire districts, all kinds of governmental entities, you may have some governmental entities working in one direction and a bunch of other governments working toward another means or another direction. And a council of government is a planning body that represents all governmental entities within a standard metropolitan statistical area. The idea is to get all levels of government, county, city, fire districts, educational districts, ISDs, moving in the same direction in order to plan the future of the standard metropolitan statistical area. Again, a standard metropolitan statistical area has a minimum of 100,000 citizens living in it, such as the Alamo Area Council of Governments that controls planning in the Texas Hill Country and throughout San Antonio, Bexar County. Councils of government help to coordinate and plan regional growth. And indeed, all federal grants that, let's say, the city of Kerrville wants to get a federal grant. Well, it makes no sense to have Kerrville moving in one direction and some other entity within the Alamo Area Council of Government working for in cross purposes to Kerrville. So all federal grants by law have to go through the Council of Government, this regional planning group. And so that was a smart thing for John Conley to advocate, and it was a smart thing for the Texas legislature to create. John Conley had an interesting way of dealing with the legislature. The legislature in Texas meets every other year in odd-numbered years. And John Conley said to himself, that's a bad way to budget, because in the year 2015, when the Texas legislature met in its regular session in 2015, government officials back in 2013 had to estimate the expenditures and the money needed to run their state agency. And then they had to plan and begin to develop a plan, not just so that the legislature could appropriate money for 2015, but the legislature would have to appropriate money for 2016 as well, i.e. until the next legislature meets in 2017. Well, that planning has to occur back in about 2014 for the legislature to meet in 2015 and commit monies for 2015 and 2016. And John Conley said it's impossible for a state administrator, an agency administrator, to accurately estimate 2.5 years out what the expenditures of his agency will be, or her agency. And so John Conley said, why don't we do this? Since the legislature meets in odd-numbered years, every 2 years in odd-numbered years, then in even-numbered years, I'll call a special session of the Texas legislature, and in odd-numbered years, the legislature can meet and budget 1 year for 2015. Then, for instance, if Conley was still governor, he would call a special session in the year 2016 to appropriate 1 year's worth of appropriations. And John Conley had a very realistic attitude about budgeting, and he helped to hold down costs. And this idea of calling special sessions in even-numbered years while the legislature meets in odd-numbered years was something that he did that no other governor has done since or before or since. And during the 1960s, we had a very good handle on the cost of Texas government because, unlike today, or even before Conley, administrators have to estimate and have to guess what their expenditures will be, something like 36 months out before the legislature can meet, and that's an impossible task for an administrator. John Conley fixed that by calling special sessions in even-numbered years. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take that telephone call.